Everyone assumed the Berbers were Arab settlers who arrived with the 7th century conquests. The DNA says something else entirely. They were already there, 12,000 years before that. If your family traces to North Africa, this is not distant history. This is written into your own chromosomes. For a long time, the story told about the Berbers was simple and mostly wrong. Arab, some said. Berber and Arab mixed, others said. A leftover population with no real deep history of its own. Population geneticists went looking at the bones instead of the assumptions. What they found in a cave called Tafaralt in eastern Morocco changed the whole timeline. 15 sets of human remains buried there almost 15,000 years ago. When their genomes were finally read, they carried something nobody expected from North Africa. A deep, ancient lineage tied more closely to early populations near the eastern Mediterranean than to anyone from sub-Saharan Africa, and a smaller thread, unmistakably, from far to the south, from deep in sub-Saharan Africa. That mixture, that exact blend, was already sitting in North Africa thousands of years before farming existed anywhere on Earth. Every later arrival, every conquest, every trade route simply layered on top of that foundation. It never replaced it. That is the mystery worth sitting with. Now let's meet the people who carried it. Say the word Berber, and most people picture one thing: nomads on camels, crossing the Sahara. But the Amazigh peoples, which is what they call themselves, were never one single group. They were farmers in the Atlas Mountains, herders on the high plateaus, and traders along the coast. Long before Rome, long before Carthage, they were already organizing kingdoms of their own. The Numidians, the Mori, names that show up in Roman histories, always as neighbors, rivals, or allies. King Massinissa, King Jugurtha, names Rome respected enough to write down and feared enough to go to war over. Then came Rome, then the Vandals, then Byzantium, then the Arab armies. Each left something behind. So the easy story became, the Berbers are whatever was left after everyone else passed through. The DNA says that gets the order backwards. They were not what was left over. They were the foundation everyone else built on. To understand how deep that foundation goes, we need to go back to a single set of bones in that Moroccan cave. This is where the DNA evidence actually begins. In 2018, a team led by Johannes Krause at the Max Planck Institute sequenced genomes from those Tafaralt remains. It was the oldest human DNA ever recovered from North Africa, almost 15,000 years old. And the ancestry inside it split roughly two ways in a pattern nobody had documented before. Roughly 2/3 of it matched a population related to the Natufians of the eastern Mediterranean near the Levant. The remaining third traced to sub-Saharan African populations, likely from deep in West Africa. 2 continents worth of ancestry already fused together 15,000 years before anyone wrote a word of history. That means if you carry Berber ancestry, that combination is not a modern coincidence. It is one of the oldest known blends of human DNA anywhere. But there was a second finding, and this one surprised the researchers even more. The Tafaralt people showed almost no trace of ancestry from sub-Saharan groups east of the Sahara, only west, which told the team something important. This was not one long uniform mixing zone. It was a specific, narrow corridor of contact. A corridor that only existed because the Sahara, back then, was not the desert we picture today. We will come back to that green Sahara. It matters more than almost anything else in this story. First, one more piece of DNA evidence, because it involves an ancestry nobody expects to find in Africa at all. The Tafaralt genomes also carried Neanderthal DNA, and more of it than expected for Africa. Not because Neanderthals lived in North Africa. They did not. It came from a back migration out of the Near East. Ancestors who had once mixed with Neanderthals somewhere near the Levant carried that inheritance back into Africa with them. It is a small percentage, roughly comparable to what shows up in populations across Europe and the Middle East. But finding it there, at that depth, in North Africa, told researchers this population had not been isolated from the wider world. It had simply been quietly connected for thousands of years in ways no written record ever mentioned. So where did these two founding populations actually come from, and why did they end up meeting exactly here? The eastern lineage, the one related to Natufian farmers, traveled a long road before it ever reached North Africa. They lived first around the eastern Mediterranean in what is now the Levant, hunting gazelle and gathering wild grain. As the last ice age eased its grip, some of them pushed west along the North African coastline. This wave is what archaeologists call the Ibero-Mauritanian culture: skilled toolmakers, careful burials, a distinct way of living. They buried their dead with care, often in flexed positions, sometimes with ochre pigment and decorated shells. That care is exactly why their DNA survived well enough 15,000 years later for us to read it at all. The second lineage, the sub-Saharan thread, arrived by a completely different road, one that no longer exists. Around 12,000 years ago, the Sahara was not sand. It was grassland, lakes, rivers, and herds of grazing animals. Rock art, still visible today, painted into cave walls across the central Sahara, shows exactly this: cattle, swimmers, hippos. People moved freely through that green corridor from what is now Mali and Niger, north toward the Mediterranean coast. It was not a desert crossing. It was simply moving from one part of a livable landscape to another. These two populations, one from the east, one from the south, met somewhere in that fertile North African belt and mixed. By the time the ice fully retreated, that mixed population was already established, already distinct, already, in every genetic sense, Berber. That is the origin. Now here is why it mattered for everything that came after. Because that green Sahara did not last, and what happened when it dried out is the true turning point of this story. Starting around 6,000 years ago, the rains that fed the Sahara's lakes began to fail. Over roughly 2,000 years, grassland turned to scrub, and scrub turned to sand. The people living in the center of that green world had to move, or die, where they stood. Most moved north, toward the Mediterranean coast, and south, toward the Sahel. That single climate shift split one people into two directions. The northern group became the ancestors of the Berber-speaking peoples we know today, pressed into a narrow coastal strip between sea and sand. For your own family tree, this is the moment the map narrows. A whole green world collapsed into a single coastal strip. Being pressed into that narrow strip did something specific to the genetics. It concentrated them. It made them distinct. Genetic studies of modern North African populations by teams, including Christian Capelli's group in Oxford, found this signature clearly. A distinct North African genetic component, found almost nowhere else on Earth at meaningful levels, running through Berber-speaking populations from Morocco to Libya. That component is the genetic fingerprint of everything we have just described. The Ice Age founders, squeezed and concentrated by the drying Sahara. But the drying Sahara was only the first turning point. The second came from the sea. Around the 9th century before the Common Era, ships from the eastern Mediterranean began landing on the North African coast. Phoenician traders, and eventually the city of Carthage, built ports and markets right alongside existing Berber settlements. This was not conquest at first. It was neighbors, trade, intermarriage, and slow genetic exchange over centuries. Genetic studies find only a modest Phoenician and Levantine signal in most Berber populations today, a few percent at most. Small but real and detectable specifically along the coast, fading the further inland and the higher into the mountains you go. That gradient itself is evidence. It shows contact happened where the ships landed and stopped where the mountains began. Then Rome arrived and stayed for 6 centuries, and the genetic story gets more complicated. Roman rule brought soldiers, administrators, and settlers, mostly concentrated in coastal cities like Carthage, Volubilis, and Timgad. But Rome never fully governed the interior. The Atlas Mountains and the desert edge stayed largely under Berber control. That divide, coastal cities under Roman law, mountains and desert under local rule, is exactly what modern DNA studies still detect. Coastal North African populations carry more Southern European and Eastern Mediterranean ancestry. Mountain populations carry far less. In other words, the mountains protected something. They kept the deep Berber signature intact, while the coast absorbed centuries of newcomers. If your ancestry traces to the High Atlas, the Rif, or the Kabyle Range, you likely carry more of that original signature than almost anyone realizes. Rome eventually collapsed in the west. The Vandals came next, then the Byzantines reclaimed the coast for a time. Each regime left administrative records, ruins, and coins. Genetically, each left almost nothing measurable. It turns out, ruling a coastline for a century does not automatically mean mixing your DNA into the people living there. Political control and genetic legacy are two very different things, and the Berber genome makes that difference visible. Then, in the 7th century, came the event most people think of first when they hear the word Berber at all. The Arab conquests, armies moving west out of Egypt across the coastal plains into the heart of the Maghreb. This time, the change was not just political. Arabic language, Islam, and new administrative structures reshaped the region within 2 centuries. And this is where the assumption crept in. New language, new religion, so surely new people. The DNA disagrees. Studies by researchers, including Karima Fadlawizid, have measured just how small the actual genetic Arab contribution really was. Across most North African populations, ancestry linked directly to the Arabian Peninsula sits in the low single digits, often under 10%. Even in populations that today speak only Arabic and identify as Arab, the underlying ancestry is overwhelmingly the same deep North African signature. Language changed. Religion changed. The genome, in large part, stayed exactly where it had been for thousands of years. That is a hard thing to sit with if you were taught that conquest always means population replacement. It rarely does. Conquest changes what language you speak at the market and what you call your god. It rarely changes who your great-great-grandmother actually was. So the turning point was never really about conquest at all. It was about which population stayed put, generation after generation, in the mountains. The coast absorbed each new arrival, layer after layer. The highlands simply kept doing what they had done since the Ice Age. They endured. And that endurance is exactly what shows up, unmistakably, in the DNA of Berber-descended people living today. Population geneticists studying North Africa keep finding the same signature. Deep Maghrebi ancestry, still intact, still dominant in highland populations today. Estelle Bousquet's team and other researchers working across Morocco and Algeria found this backbone lineage in villages that never once considered themselves anything but Arab. The label on the outside changed, language changed, religion changed. The genome underneath moved far less than anyone expected. That is the part the old story missed entirely. Arabization was never really a replacement. It was a costume change over an unbroken body. So who actually carries this today? That is where the story stops being about the past and starts being about specific living families. Start with the Canary Islands. Long before Spanish sailors arrived, the Guanche people already lived there, and their ancestry traces straight back to the Maghreb coast. Mitochondrial studies of Guanche remains found lineages matching Berber populations almost exactly. They crossed by boat, not by accident, centuries before Rome ever noticed. So, if your family carries Canary Islander roots, you are not just Spanish by inheritance. You are carrying a Maghrebi signature that arrived on a reed boat. That same Canary lineage rode the currents again, 4 centuries later, straight into the Americas, into Louisiana, Texas, and the Caribbean. Louisiana's Isleno communities, the descendants of Canary settlers, still carry that Maghrebi backbone today. It survived a second ocean crossing intact. Now look at Sicily and southern Spain. Centuries of Maghrebi rule left a genetic trace that outlasted every regime change that followed it. Studies of Sicilian genomes still detect measurable North African ancestry, a residue of the centuries when the island's rulers came from across that same sea. If your family tree runs through Sicily or Andalusia, some fraction of what you carry did not come from Rome or from Iberia at all. It came from the mountains, from people who never left them, who watched every empire pass through and simply stayed. This is the part most people never learn about their own ancestry test. Berber ancestry rarely shows up under its own name. It hides inside categories called Spanish, Sicilian, Canary Islander, Sephardic Jewish, even parts of the French Mediterranean coast. Sephardic Jewish communities expelled from Iberia carried North African admixture picked up during centuries living alongside Berber neighbors in the Maghreb. Haplogroup studies of these communities, published by researchers working with Mediterranean Jewish populations, show exactly that layered inheritance, still readable centuries later. So the mystery was never really about Berbers alone. It was about how much of the Mediterranean world quietly carries their signature. The Amazigh people were never a footnote standing at the edge of someone else's story. They were the story's foundation. Every empire that crossed North Africa borrowed land, labor, and language from them. Almost none of them replaced them. That is a rare thing in human history. Most conquered peoples vanish into the conquerors. This one simply absorbed them instead. That is what the DNA is actually telling us. Not a story of erasure, but a story of remarkable, quiet persistence. If you carry Iberian, Sicilian, Canary Islander, Sephardic, or broader Mediterranean ancestry, this thread very likely runs through you too. Not as a footnote in a database, as a lineage that walked out of the Ice Age and never stopped walking. Somewhere in the mix of markers that make up your genome, there may be a highland that never fell to anyone. A people who watched Phoenicians, Romans, Vandals, Arabs, and Ottomans come and go and simply stayed exactly where they were. That endurance is not a story locked away in an archive. It is written quietly into the DNA some of you are carrying right now. So look closer at your own results. The mountain may already be part of you. Thank you for sitting with this story.